A very warm good afternoon to everyone and to Professor Soumick Day. At the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Soumick for agreeing to give this lecture on a very, very fascinating topic. I was extremely interested when I read the abstract, and a couple of people also shared that they were looking forward very much to today's session. So thank you so much, Dr. Soumick, for making this time and agreeing to speak to us. Before we begin, I'd like to just briefly introduce Dr. Soumick. Dr. Soumick Dey is an adjunct faculty in the Department of Psychosocial and Clinical Studies at the Ambedkar University, Delhi, and he's also a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Council of Social Science Research, ICSSR. His book, Perversion, Pedagogy, and the Comic by Arcad Books came out in 2020. So on that brief note, once again, thank you, Dr. Soumick, and welcome you all to today's session.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. So first, let me thank all the organizers, NIAS, the organizers at NIAS, and particularly my friend Saurav, who asked me to, who invited, whose generosity has always been there, who has asked me to give this talk on a subject which is on which I'm trying to work out a problem vis-a-vis the questions that I'm going to at least address today. But thank you to all the organizers and of course Saurav. So yeah, let me start by saying a few things. Firstly, that this whole question of self and experience in dramaturgy, on which this lecture is based, which is a huge topic. It's particularly the question of self and consciousness, as you must know because you have been part of these lectures. They are a very old question in philosophy, and they follow different traditions. Well, so what I'll try to do is I'll try to focus on localize in that sense on certain particular problems and work out if we can, if not define and must not define the question of self and experience, but at least figure out a way to think through these concepts. And so I in the beginning because I was asked to share a text, I have shared a text by Jacques Derrida, the French philosopher. But I realized that if I have to focus on the text, that itself is not perhaps possible in 1 hour. And to relate that text, to contextualize that text vis-a-vis the question of dramaturgy is even more difficult. But I'll try to work these things out. So I'm going to protect myself from, I'm going to speak from a very protective position, which is that of a text that I have written, a kind of a lecture that I have written, which tackles with a few of these problems. But then, of course, the last part of it about the text that I have circulated, I'll try to point out certain general questions vis-a-vis theater, which that text proposes. So let me then immediately go to the lecture itself. So the title the title of this lecture, as you must know, which is there in the abstract, is Theatre as the Absence of Work, a theatrological examination into the contemporary problem of aesthetics. Now, this is a scandalously, and it's an ugly title because it's a huge title, and I don't like such huge titles, but it kind of it is also a conclusive title. These terms, theatrological, aesthetics, absence of work. These terms are terms which this lecture would try by the end of it, if possible, to have a to grasp, if not define. And this is not a question of definition of these terms. It is a question of trying to figure out a way to not even understand, but have a certain certain grasp, certain access to these terms. What do they, in that sense, point towards, direct towards? So I'll not immediately go into defining what these terms are. So let me just work out what is dramaturgy in that sense, on the basis of which this entire lecture is based. So let me just start reading out, and then we can explain some of the terms while I'm reading the lecture. How much time do I have? How long should I speak?
Till about 4:20, 4:25, and then there'll be about let's say half an hour for interaction.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Sure. So 40 minutes is enough for this, at least to begin to at least begin asking certain questions. So the general theme of today's lecture is self and experience in dramaturgy. So as you can understand, it is not humanly possible to talk about self and experience generally. The concepts of self and experience have a long history in Western philosophy, as it has for me. The concept of dramaturgy, on the other hand, is a bit more particular. But mind you, only just a little bit more so. The history of the concept of dramaturgy in Western theatre at least starts from the end of 16th century, and is still, that is, dramaturgy is still particularly in the West, what you can call a hot topic. So it doesn't make our job any easier to talk about dramaturgy, especially when we place it within the history of theatre. So we need to analyze by focusing on something a bit more localized. We see this operation of localization, and this operation of localization is the very task of thinking. We can't think in general about, say, something like being or something like consciousness. We need to localize in order to think. Otherwise, we just repeat what someone else has said. Like, for example, being is nothing. Or inversely, being is not nothing. Deconstruction is affirmative. Or inversely, deconstruction is destructive. Taken in their generality, they are something like slogans. We can repeat them. They can be used polemically. And they create an effect. You can win an argument by declaring one of them. In that sense, they have a political use. But you can't start to think from them when put in this general use. In order to start to think, you need to localize these statements within a problem. And this is something we will continuously return to. What is a problem? So, localization in that sense, let me just say in the very beginning, is the function of problems. So, for example, if you ask the question, what happens to the philosophical question of being when religion takes over philosophy in the West with the advent of Christianity? This is not only a historical question, but also indicative of a moment in the history of the West when philosophy itself becomes a problem. Should Christianity replace philosophy? Should Christianity absorb philosophy? Should Christianity denounce philosophy? All of these questions can be gathered together under the rubric the problem of philosophy with the advent of Christianity. We can start thinking about the question of being, that is, being, the philosophical understanding of being, from this point of localization, as did the Christian theologians in the second, third century, when Christianity comes to the West. So a problem, the French word for it is problematic, is never about seeking solutions. And this is something which is imperative for us to understand, that a problem is not about solutions. A problem is a mode to access thought. It's a mode of thinking. Problem is not about seeking solutions. Solutions are only part of problems. So a problem is never about seeking solutions. It is the state prior to a solution. It comes before an identity is given to a problem and the problem is closed off. The solution is something which is imposed upon a problem. Solution is the identity. So you say, who is a woman? And you define who a woman is. It basically closes off. A definition always closes off the problem. So it is the state prior to a solution. Problem is not representation. This is the point. Problem is not representation or meaning. Problem is when you question the very structure of the meaning given to something at a particular point. Why does something mean something at a particular point? Why is it that what we call theater today is called theater today and was not called theater 100 years back? Or was it called theater 100 years back? So problem is when you open meaning up to its limits. It's a question of limits. Now, what is the limit? What is the boundary within which we define theater today? And what is that helps us understand that, okay, there was a different boundary, a different limitation within which theater was defined sometime before. And these boundaries change. Whenever we think from the perspective of limits, we always think in the perspective of something which is transforming. Therefore, problem is when you question the very structure of the meaning. Therefore, problems never provide solutions or meanings on the basis of which one can act or behave or conduct oneself. No? Problem is an effort to detach yourself from meaning and think about the nature of the meaning itself at its very threshold, at its very limit. Problem opens up a path to think about limit experiences. And this is something we can discuss later. This needs elaboration. So I can't expand this further, but you have a basic idea of what I understand by problem. So then we start with the topic itself. This is a sort of a methodological detour. What is the problem of theater? So this is a simple question of origin. Okay, when we talk about dramaturgy, because it was titled as dramaturgy, so I thought it would be interesting to study what is the origin of dramaturgy. No, dramaturgy is not theater. This is something you have to understand. Dramaturgy is not theater in the specific sense in which dramaturgy emerges at a particular point in theater history. So dramaturgy is not the totality of theater or entirety. The dramaturgy emerges at a particular point in the history of theater. And this is something we will understand. We'll try to interrogate through the question of a problem. No? What is the problem of theater which instigates the emergence of something like dramaturgy? And if we investigate that particular moment in theater where dramaturgy, thing called dramaturgy, this thing that we are still to define, this thing called dramaturgy emerges, if we investigate that, then we have a certain relationship between what is theater and what is a general understanding of aesthetics. So this is the first part of the lecture, which is to relate something like the specific practice of theater, the specific idea of theater, to the general idea of aesthetics. Aesthetics also is something which has a history. No, aesthetics is also something which just doesn't, is not just a given definition of aesthetics. So it is a question of aesthetics also emerges more or less around the same time that the problem of dramaturgy emerges. And what is this relationship is the first part of the lecture. So we have to ask, what is the problem of theater when a new thing emerges called dramaturgy, you know, by the end of 16th century? So we are going to take a look at a text which is seen as the inaugural text of dramaturgy. It is a text by a German philosopher called G.E. Lessing, one of the pioneering philosophers of the 17th century, that is the Enlightenment. Sorry, not 17th, 18th century, just the continuation of the Enlightenment. In a text which is about the end of 18th century, that is 1769, the German writer, philosopher, and dramatist G.E. Lessing, okay, explains this problem of dramaturgy. Now you have to understand that Lessing is seen as the father of dramaturgy. He is the creator, the author. He is seen as the originator of the very concept of dramaturgy, as we understand it today. So he writes, Lessing writes a series of essays from the period of 1767 to 1769, while he is appointed officially the first dramaturg. He is appointed the first dramaturg of the Hamburg Theater in Germany, the Hamburg National Theater in Germany. And this series of essays that Lessing writes is published later on, which is called the Hamburg Dramaturgy. This is the beginning of what we understand as dramaturgy within theater history. Now, this is not theater. This is neither the beginning nor the end of theater history. No, this is only a moment in the history of theater. So the Hamburg. So in the preface, okay, of the Hamburg Dramaturgy, Lessing calls the dramaturg, who is the dramaturg? The dramaturg as the friend of the theater. The friend of the theater. Now, what is the definition of a friend here? A friend for Lessing is he who has the right to judge what plays should be staged and what play should not be staged. But more importantly, the friend of the theater is an aesthete. No? Aesthete. What is an aesthete? No? Who does not simply enjoy the pleasures of theater, but think about what is the right amount of pleasure that a dramatic piece, when performed on stage, should produce. This is something which is very important. It is not simply that he is someone who is enjoying, he is someone who is reflecting on enjoyment. He is not somebody like the audience who is no, who is immersed in the pleasure of the play or the theater. Someone who is also reflecting on the very nature of that pleasure, how much pleasure is generated, how much pleasure it should generate. A bad play is generating more pleasure, or a good play is not generating enough pleasure. No? So let me just quote a small section from this preface. So Lessing writes, not every fault finder should fancy himself the audience, and someone whose expectations are disappointed needs to stop and think a bit about the nature of these expectations. These are expectations vis-a-vis the play. Not every enthusiast is a connoisseur. Not every person who perceives the beauty of one play or the correct performance of one actor can thereby also judge the value of all others. So the aesthete is someone who has to have a distant or a generalized opinion. It is not simply a question of particulars. Particular plays have to be, there has to be a form of distanciation. There has to be a form of distanciation from a particular play so that you can generalize about theater as such, about plays as such. A person who has only a biased taste has no taste. But he is often therefore more partisan. And this is, and next two lines are the most important. True taste, true taste is general and extends to beautiful things of every kind, but it does not expect more pleasure or delight from them that can be afforded by their particular nature. This means what? This means that the aesthete is someone who, through whatever process, has to assign the correct pleasure or the correct enjoyment to the object which is producing that enjoyment. That means if there is a play which is A and the play is producing B quantity of enjoyment, then A and B should be identical. In other words, that A should produce B enjoyment and not C enjoyment. Everything should be one, it should produce exactly the enjoyment that it ought to produce. So that is the judgment. Now this is an aesthetic judgment. If you read Kant's critique of judgment, you see a very close relationship between what Kant is calling an aesthetic judgment and what Lessing here is calling taste. As you can see, this is an aesthetic judgment. The dramaturg's function is not simply to enjoy, but find a distance within her thought where the enjoyment or pleasure of theater becomes also a question of knowledge. It is not simply a question of enjoyment, but a question of knowledge. It is something similar to what Kant would call aesthetic judgment towards aesthetic art or fine art or high art, where pleasure is addressed to knowledge, as against agreeable art, which is merely for enjoyment. So in Critique of Judgement, let me explain this a bit. In Critique of Judgement, Kant talks about aesthetic judgment as a kind of play of faculties. No? It is a play of the faculty of imagination and understanding. It is not knowledge in the sense of concept, but neither is it enjoyment which is devoid of thinking. So in Critique of Judgement, aesthetic judgment is a kind of in between. It is the in between something which is pure pleasure and something which is pure thinking. It is something which is the possibility of knowledge. No? So this is the kind of aesthetic judgment which Kant proposes towards fine art, as in high art, while he talks about another form of art, a kind of low art, which is what he calls agreeable art, which is laughter, comedy. These are agreeable forms, wit, which he says is all about enjoyment. There is no critical distance in which there is a possibility of knowledge. You know, in case of agreeable art, it is completely immersed in knowledge. Immersed in enjoyment or pleasure. So you see that there is an idea of distance which is inscribed in the idea of an aesthetic judgment. And it is the same kind of a distance that Lessing is talking about when he is saying that the function of the dramaturg or the function of dramaturgy is to judge what plays should be allowed and what plays shouldn't be allowed to be placed on stage. So it is basically the function of the dramaturg is the function of the one who can produce aesthetic judgment. This is the basic point. And this is coming from a person from whom the entire idea of dramaturgy begins. So unlike an ordinary audience whose pleasure is immediate, the aesthete or dramaturg would find enjoyment in the reflective distance from which he or she can judge the object, which is the dramatic object, and assess the enjoyment it produces. Now, this is the implicit meaning of true taste in Lessing. The right or correct amount of pleasure which should be produced by a dramatic performance is determined by distance, by not being too close or immersed in the object of pleasure. This is the aesthetic function of the dramaturg as a subject who assesses the dramatic object. So this is the first point of Lessing, that the dramaturg has to be an aesthete. That is, the dramaturg has to produce an aesthetic judgment. This is the first point. Now the second point is that in order for you to produce an aesthetic judgment, you first have to, and this is something which is also there in Kant, that the object which produces this pleasure, no, you have to receive that object through your senses. You have to see it. You have to ponder upon it. You have to linger on that object, so that those objects can, through the faculty of intuition, in Kant particularly, through intuition, it comes to your within, it comes inside you, and you can then organize it, and then you can think about it. But with theater, so in other words, any aesthetic judgment is presupposed by the idea that the object of art is there. The object of art, no, is already there. The object of art is stable. But theater creates a very difficult problem here, because theater is such an art form which, as you can understand, disappears because the performance is there and the performance then disappears. So this becomes the problem. This is the problem of how do you produce aesthetic judgment when the very object of art in theater is something which is continuously disappearing, unlike a painting which is there in front of you, or a sculpture which is there in front of you. There the image can come inside the faculty so that the faculty of imagination and the faculty of understanding can organize it and then produce the aesthetic judgment. But for theater, this image itself is not entering properly because the object itself has a very strange kind of a status. The object is continuously disappearing. That is, the performance is disappearing on stage. The actors come, play, and then they go. You cannot return to that. Of course, the problem would be tackled differently today, because then there is something like recording. You can record the performance. That was not available, of course, there then. So this is the next problem. Now the second function of the dramaturg. So how does Lessing in that sense solve this problem, in other words? So the aesthetic is not, so you see, it is also the emergence of the problem of a particular problem of theater, but it is also Lessing is trying to solve this problem. And what does he say? Now the second function of the dramaturg is to be the connecting link, the bridge between the text and the stage, between the writer and the actor. So Lessing writes, for example, that this dramaturgy will maintain a critical register of all the plays that will be produced, and it will follow every step here of the plays which are staged. So the dramaturg is the embodiment of a relation which makes theater relevant to the art of both the writer and the actor. So this is something we need to understand. So what is he saying? He is saying that in order for you to judge, in order for there to be an aesthetic judgment, what you have to do is somehow manage to make the impermanence of theater, the transitory nature of theater, into something which is permanent, into something which is stable. And the only way one can do it is to establish a link between that which is always there, which is the dramatic text, the play text. Because the dramatic text is still there, say Shakespeare's Hamlet is still here. No, it is not something which has changed. What has changed is the different performances of Hamlet over the years. So how Hamlet was performed in the 18th century, you can reconstruct it through archive, through historical material, but you cannot exactly go back to that play, that performance of Hamlet, say, like you can go back to the play Hamlet, the text Hamlet. So you have a certain relationship between the transitory, impermanent, disappearing element of theater, which is that of the stage, which is that of the actor, and everything which is related to performance. And then you have the other part, which is the dramatic text. Now, what Lessing wants to do is, the only way you can provide an aesthetic judgment is when you anchor, when you basically a kind of absorb, or when you basically the best metaphor is anchoring. Like an anchor makes the boat stop at a particular point, or the boat will continuously float. So like that, this continuous flow of performances has to be stopped, and it can only be stopped when it is anchored to the text. So you have a particular problem which emerges of which the dramaturg is the embodiment, which is that the text is the determining factor of the performance, or in other words, the play, the dramatic text becomes the in other words the kind of reference point from which all performances draw their source. So the text becomes the source of all performances, and this is what the aesthete, this is what the dramaturg ensures, that the relationship from between the text and the performance is always on the side of the text, not on the side of the performance. Hence, the dramaturg's work and his challenge is to help the actor, for example, anchor his performance on the text. Are you being true to the text, or are you just doing improvisations by yourself, which has nothing to do with what the author wanted you to say or what author wanted you to do on stage? Is it a correct representation of the text? Lessing writes that the actor must, and I quote Lessing here, constantly think with the writer, and when something all too human overtakes the writer, he must think for him. Unquote. In other words, the actor must not replace the writer, but take the place of the writer when the writer is not sure or is not sure, or the writer is uncertain. That means that the that means that even when the writer betrays the text, the actor should not betray the text. Yeah? So the text is omnipotent in that sense. The text is all powerful. The text is the authority. The text is, in other words, a kind of God figure, kind of a father figure or a God figure. And it is this problem of this over determination of the text which is behind the over determination of, this is something which later on Derrida would call a certain logocentrism, a certain over determination of speech, an over determination of language. That language is not simply a question of language, that is, it is not simply a question of the text, it is also a question of power. It is this power which the aesthete has to ensure. So aesthetic judgment is not simply a question of aesthetic judgment, that what is good or what is bad play. Aesthetic judgment is also a question of power. It is to keep in place the power of the author, the power of the text, the power of the writer. No? But in case of theater, this is even more so, because there is an element of theater which will always escape this, which will try to escape this authority, which is the performance itself. That means that a performance has a very strange kind of a presence, because it is a presence which constantly disappears, because it is a presence which is not static, that is a presence which is always already absent. It is a presence which is disappearing. It is not what, again, Derrida would later on call the presentation of the presence, that is a present which is always already there. It is always there, it is already given. This is a kind of presence which is the presence of the text, while the other kind of a presence, which is the presence of the performance itself, is something which kind of always is it kind of short circuits the text. And this is something which, if we have time, we will see how Derrida tries to work out in a different theatrical thinker, which is Antonin Artaud. So this is the beginning. While in case of Artaud, we will find a kind of the same problem, which is the relationship between the text and the performance. But while in case of Lessing, the performance has to be subservient to the text. so that there can be an aesthetic judgment. For Antonin Artaud, the text has to be abolished. There will be only the performance. There cannot be any text. The only text is, the only presence is that presence which is there on stage, a presence which will continuously disappear. So a kind of immediacy of the presence, not the given static, presentation of the presence. This is the problem. So this is the origin of dramaturgy, which is actually not an origin at all, but a problem internal to theater between the text and performance. This is the first one. Now, one can say a lot of things about this, but I will just, so for example, that this problem of the text, between the text and the performance, the danger of the performance, which has to be, in a way, the threat of the performance, which has to be stabilized by the word or stabilized by language. The performance is continuously fleeting. Performance, pata nahi what kind of emotion it will generate in what people. Nothing is fixed in case of the performance. Nothing is fixed when it comes to what unfolds on stage. The only fixity that a performance has is the text. And this fixity is something which is always desired. And this is a problem which is, if we see, I'll just has a detour I'll talk, and then I'll come to the second point, that this is something which is also the problem when theater, in a way, comes into religion within Christianity. This is something which I have tried to work on before, which is that, for example, there are performances, Christian rituals, and one of those rituals was kind of, so singing is one of the rituals, Christian singing. But the problem with Christian singing was, at a point during the 7th, 8th century, from where all of these Gregorian chants and all of this develops, it also starts with a certain problem, which is that if you give too much importance to the voice, to the performance of singing, that becomes a danger for for disseminating the religious message, because people start enjoying the singing for the singing itself. This is what the church fathers say, that you start enjoying the singing not because it is about God, but it is because it is a simple performance. So what do you do? What did the Gregorian, particularly there was a church father called Gregory of Nyssa. So Gregorian chant basically tried to a very specific mode. I'm not going into that, which is basically to anchor the singing, the notes of music, to syllables. Each note should have a corresponding syllable. So you see what is happening. Same thing, which is happening later on, that the performance has to be anchored onto the word. The performance, the how do you say, but there is a called a beautiful word, souffle, which is flying away, which is continuously, which is always in a state of flight, which kind of disappears. You have to make it static. You have to put it into a solid ground, and that solid ground here meaning the solid ground of the word of God. So everything has to be then attached to word, and here word means in the religious, in the Christian sense, that singing has to mean something. It is the words which are more important and not the notes. So you see this relationship between performance and the text, between language and performance, that is what is unfolding on stage, is a very old relationship. This is an old problem. This is not something which is starting, which is suddenly there within theater history with dramaturgy. Dramaturgy is a kind of a new way to solve this problem. Understand? It is a new way to solve an old genealogy of a problem. Okay. We can talk about this later, this Christian part of it, but you understand this relationship. So this is the first part, which is the part of an aesthetic judgment. What we have to keep in mind is, no matter what this relationship is, it is a relationship which is based upon, as we said, distance. You have to distantiate yourself from the art object. And this is a reflective distance, this is a contemplative distance. You know? And without that distance, there can't be any aesthetic judgment. This is the basic point. Without a reflective distance, without, in that sense, the subject and the object of art and the subject have to be in a dialectical relationship. There is in an oppositional relationship. Now, the subject and the object can't be identical. The subject has to pose itself against the object. So there is a logic of negation, which is there in the reflective distance. Not exactly negation in Kant. In Kant, it is not exactly a question of negation. We can talk about it later. But this is the point. There is a distance. Now, what is happening today in art? This is very important. Now, otherwise, what is the point of saying all of this? What is the problem of theater today? In order to understand what is the problem of theater today, it has certain, we can describe the problem, which is that theater is almost vanishing. Matlab, theater is more and more becoming a kind of a, of a kind of a very elite kind of, some very few people go to the theater. It is something which is not a, not a mass art form. It is not even a collective art form where people, there is, though there is an NSD and National Institute of Drama, but theater as such, we don't hear about theater except from theater people, almost exclusively. Only those who practice theater talk about theater. There is no such thing as a, but we talk of, everyone talks about cinema. Cinema, there is no, it is not just that we hear about cinema from those who practice cinema. Cinema is a mass art form in that sense. Theater is a very, very small, it is almost something which is disappearing as an art form. This is, say, the one problem, descriptively, that nobody goes to the theater anymore. That is one. And the other problem is, and the extension of that problem is that this is ironical, because a cinema can play itself. No, this is just a commonsensical thing. If you go to a theater and you watch a cinema, if you walk out, say you are the only audience in a theater, and you walk out, there will be no change in the cinema itself on the screen. It will keep on playing exactly the way it would play if the house was full. But theater, you can't say the same thing. A theater is a art form which presupposes a collective, which presupposes a gathering of bodies, a collection of people. And if, so for example, the great theater director, thinker, Peter Brooks defines theater like this, that for theater, there has to be a single person walking across an empty stage, and there has to be a single pair of eyes in the audience to watch it. So that single pair of eye is very important for the theater to take place. You can't have a theater without an audience, almost impossible. But you can have a cinema without an audience. This is a basic change. No? But unfortunately, or for whatever, even strangely, today, the only audience which we seem to have is of cinema. While theater is something which is becoming more and more a kind of an obsolete thing. So why is this happening? It is not simply that this is, we can say that this is happening because of, Western culture. You can't say that, because theater, same problem is happening in the West. And theater, as much as it is an Indian part of Indian tradition, it is as much a part of Western tradition. You can't say that it is because of cinema. It is, of course, it has to do with capital. It has to do with the certain form of, late capitalism, the kind of cultural capitalism, a society of consumption in which we live. But what exactly is it? We can't just say that, okay, it is because of we live in such a materialistic world which is full of consumption of materials and enjoyment that nobody bothers about theater. We can't just say certain general statements. You have to pinpoint what is the problem. Again, the question of problem becomes important. What is the problem vis-a-vis theater today? No? Hmm? And when we ask what is the problem vis-a-vis theater today, we have to ask a bit general question. What is the problem vis-a-vis art or aesthetics today? Hmm? Is what we talked about a kind of aesthetic judgment which was there in the 18th, 19th century? Is it even possible today? Is aesthetic judgment even possible? So this is the second part of this lecture. I will just wrap up this in 10 minutes, 10-15 minutes, and we'll not talk about the third part which we were talking about, which is Derrida's text on Antonin Artaud. We can discuss, keep it on, we can take it up on discussion, because that is a very complicated, extremely complex text, and we cannot just talk about it in 10 minutes. That would be extremely arrogant of me or anybody vis-a-vis Derrida and the text. But let us talk about the problem of theater today, or the problem of aesthetics today. Now we come to the second problem, the contemporary problem of aesthetics, and what happens to dramaturgy within it. And dramaturgy, you can loosely think of theater only as this understanding of theater. Interestingly, the contemporary problem of aesthetics also roughly coincides with the current problem of theater, or to be precise, with the problem of dramaturgy. So it announces a certain end of aesthetics. This is the point. That today there is a certain declaration. Whether it is there or not is for us to examine. That there is a certain end of aesthetics as well as an end of theater and dramaturgy, particularly dramaturgy. The question is, how does it manage to do this? But this question is preceded by another more fundamental question. What is the governing factor of calling something beautiful today? What do we understand by beautiful today, which is the basis of any aesthetic judgment? What is the aesthetic imperative today, if there is any? So today, the question of beauty is no longer determined by taste, which advocates reflective distance. This is the point. Today, pleasure has to be immediate, instantly communicable, and immediately consumable. This is the essence of a consumer society in that sense. And that which perfectly fits the requirements of immediate pleasure is the smooth. And this is something which is a very interesting point. Not mine, somebody else said it, but we can think about this. That today this immediate pleasure is the how do I say, the paradigmatic or the essential model for this immediate pleasure of consumption is the smooth surface, the smooth body. The aesthetic effect exclusive to our time is that beauty does not injure, beauty does not hurt. Beauty is something which is related to a certain idea of health or positivity. Think of the smartphones, the pleasure of surfing on the smooth virtual spaces of the internet, gliding through the innumerable choices of films and series and shows available at the touch of your screen on Netflix. None of them offer resistance. They are all some way related to an idea of smoothness. They evoke the smoothness of surfaces, the flexibilities of bodies, and the fluidity of communication. This is not something which is just limited to the materiality of the smooth surface, which is also there, the smartphone being the classic example today. but it is also the smoothness, the non-disruptive element of communication, continuous information, continuous communication. Now, this is what is a very interesting philosopher, the Korean German philosopher called Byung-Chul Han. Byung-Chul Han. He calls this the aesthetics of smoothness. Aesthetics of smoothness. The aesthetics of smoothness is determined by intimacy and proximity. It can be touched. It has to be immediate. It produces what is called haptic pleasures. Haptic, haptic is related to the sense of touch. The pleasure of touching. However, it is a kind of touch which abolishes distance, which produces immediate enjoyment, like gliding through your smartphones. Now, you see, touch is something which is a very complex philosophical question, because touch is also, Derrida has a book on touch, which is on the philosophy of another philosopher, which is Jean-Luc Nancy. But this is not that kind of a touch, not the philosophic concept of touch, the way Derrida or Nancy or these people understand. Let me give you an example why it is this kind of smartphone touch is not an aesthetic idea of touch. Why? Say, for example, this touch is unlike the kiss of the lover, which is immortalized by Rodin's sculpture. Rodin was a sculptor who built who is there's a almost a very famous sculpture called the kiss, about it is about two lovers who are kissing, which is also a question of touch. Chitra Prashad was a great Bengali painter, one of the great painters of our of Bengal at during the 40s, 50s. The Chitra Prashad was he painted. He also painted a figure which was that of a couple kissing. So the question of touch is essential to painting, for example, or essential to visual arts. But this is not the same kind of touch that we are talking about vis-a-vis the smartphones. Why? Because because Rodin's kiss or Chitra Prashad's painting, which is that of a kiss, is awe-inspiring because it is a singular coming together of two senses, the intimacy of the touch and the distance of viewing. Because it is finally a sculpture, finally a visual medium, but it is at the same time a visual medium which is presenting something which is that of touch. So there is a kind of how do you say that, there is a question of two senses which are come as one sense, which is it is a relationship between form and content. One form is, but form and content both are two types of senses here. No, it is a visual depiction of another sense, which is that of touch, which is that of kissing. So in Rodin's sculpture, the kiss evokes the intimacy of a distance, the irreplaceable aura of an alien intimacy. The kiss in Rodin or Chitra Prashad, one can say, belongs to the other. This is very important, the question of the other in art. However, the aesthetic pleasure of smoothness today is determined by a mode of perception which follows the social and cultural imperative of positivity, which can be indefinitely reproduced. What does it mean? It means that Rodin's paint, this is something which Walter Benjamin, the German philosopher, also talked about, which is the mechanical reproduction of art. What does it do to earlier forms of art which were singular? So there is just one Rodin, or there is just one Chitra Prashad painting. But today you have immediately 1,000 copies. Images are built upon the logic of a mechanical reproduction, and it is a reproduction is always a reproduction of the same. So there is a kind of systematic erasure, a systematic disappearance of the question of otherness, of the question of a kind of a radical difference, a question of negativity in that sense. some form of negativity. It is all positive. It is all one image on top of which there is another image, or one image replaced by another image, replaced by another image, replaced by another image. It is something which is accumulated. This is very important. That the question of positivity today in art, and not just in art, it is something which is there in society also. The question of consumption is based upon a question of positivity, which depends upon a logic of accumulation or addition. You know, health is all about health is all about accumulation. Now, we can talk about these things later on, but we're talking about the smooth surface. So the smooth surface is immediately available. The smooth surface is an optimization of a logic of presence. Now, immediately available means that something which is present. That is something which is in front of you, something which is given to you. Yeah. So this problem, which is the problem of positivity, which is the problem of presence in the sense of a full frontal presence, and the problem of accumulation. All of these put together gives you a certain aesthetic consciousness, which is not at all determined by distance. On the contrary, it is something which is determined by proximity, closeness. And it is this closeness or intimacy which erases, which is a kind of a disappearance of aesthetic distance, which makes aesthetic into what people, particularly Byung-Chul Han, this philosopher, calls anesthesia, anesthetization, a kind of sedative pleasure, a kind of a passive pleasure. It is no longer the active contemplative gesture of an aesthetic judgment anymore. It is a simple question of passive consumption, because consumption does not require reflection. Consumption requires a particular form of feelings or particular forms of enjoyment, in that sense, which can be replaced immediately by a similar enjoyment. And this is something which we find, say, for example, in, if you see cinema, for example, you see what is happening with Netflix. With Netflix, you have no longer the idea of a cinema of the auteurs or the cinema of the great, a kind of a cinema which is self-reflective. If you see the cinema of Godard, if you see the cinema of Abbas Kiarostami, these are all self-reflective because it reflects upon, because cinema also deploys images. Okay, this is the point. Cell phone, smartphone also, there is a question of images. But the images of the images you find in smartphone, or the images of a selfie is never self-reflective. But a Godard's image in, say, Godard film is a self-reflective image. It is an image which is very much aware of the fact that it is an image. In other words, it tries to create a distance. In other words, it tries to maintain a kind of an aesthetic distance within the art form itself. This is what is continuously being replaced by a question of, no matter what film you see, it is basically a kind of a variation of another film, a kind of an immediate replacement. So this is the problem today. This is a problem of anesthetization, where theater is basically, in a way, disappearing. And let me just point out one more point and I'll finish. Is that okay? I mean, 5 more minutes. Is that
sure,
okay?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. So there is a great German modern theater director writer called Botho Strauss. So Botho Strauss suddenly retired from theater, I think in the 80s. When asked that why did you retire from the theater, he said that I came to the theater to make erotic theater. While today theater is defined by a certain pornography. Now understand this. This is not simply a question of pornography in the literal sense of what we as pornography, or eroticism in the literal sense of nude bodies or naked. It is also the idea of pornography, on the idea of eroticism, which is that there is, he said, a certain that same thing, a certain immediacy in eroticism, in pornography, a certain on your face, a certain immediate, flat, a kind of a smooth surface. There is no depth in pornography. There is no veiling in pornography. Everything is undisclosed. While eroticism is something which is always veiled. Eroticism is something where there is a play of closure and disclosure, of veiling and unveiling. And this relationship between veiling and unveiling, between something which is exposed and something which is hidden, he said this is the essence of play and this is the essence of theater. While in today's society, which is the smooth society of surfaces, or the smooth society of smooth society of immediate positive images which are to be consumed, you do not have this kind of a relationship between veiling and unveiling. This is what he calls pornography. And in a society of pornographic society, in this society of consumption, theater is not possible, because theater will always have a certain kind of a play between presence and absence. And this presence and absence can be looked at in very complicated but fascinating manner. That is a question of that. This is what we talked about earlier, right? The presence of the text and the absence of the text at the same time on stage. So this kind of a presence absence, veiling unveiling, disclosure undisclosure is something which is not available in a society where everything has to be exposed, everything has to be undisclosed, everything has to be, in that sense, a society of transparency. This is what Byung-Chul Han calls a society of transparency. And hence it is so difficult to have theater as such. But then what to do? That is the last point. And here I think a great philosopher, another French philosopher, once said that an act of creation is always an act of resistance. It means what? It means that if there is a true act of creation, and it need not be a political resistance, it's not a question of politics in the sense that you have to march on stage with red flags or some other flag. It is not the content which is political, but the very act of creation itself. Because an act of creation always introduces or always disrupts this kind of a continuous representation, continuous reproduction of the same. And this is what we need today. We need a certain act of creation. That is a new way to think about theater. It is the simple way of saying that, not go back to the earlier traditional understanding of theater, which is the relationship of theater and text, where the text is this kind of an aesthetic judgment, but also not to give up on theater, but to find a new language of theater. And Antonin Artaud, which we will not talk about now, is perhaps one of the key figures who provides us with a new language of theater, a kind of an act of a creative act within theater which resists many of these societies of positivity, a kind of a logic of presence in which we find ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soumick, for that very, very thought-provoking lecture. The floor is now open for any questions, any sharing that you might want to do. As always, the raise hand function, I'm sure all of you know where that is. So please do raise your hand in case of any question. Before I begin, let me just say that there is one question from the chat box that I'd like to read out.
Yeah, please do.
So Sundar asks, what about, I think this was when you were talking about, I mean, I think it was more about how movie has taken over,
Yeah.
right? And it was in the context of movies being, I think, uh, ready. They don't really allow you to think that much. They hand it over to you on a platter. And in that context, he says, what about the lowest form of comedy, slapstick comedy or vulgar porn, where the incongruity or grotesque itself is a source of comedy?
So incongruity or grotesque is itself
A source of comedy.
source of comedy. Yeah.
I
Thank
think
you.
you partially answered this question in the end
Mm-hmm.
when you spoke about the distinction between. Uh,
No, no. See, it's not a question of. Should I answer this now, or should I collect a few questions? How do you do this?
um,
And answer this.
yeah, why don't you answer this first and then we can take some questions?
No, there is nothing wrong with grotesque. Grotesque can be and has always been a great source of art. It is nothing wrong with, you know, there is nothing wrong with the material. It is to do with the process. The material, in case of comedy, for example, you can have a comedy on almost anything. It is not a problem of the material. It is a problem of what comedy does, you know. Let me answer you with an example. So what is it that a comedy does? Say the classic example of comedy is a person, you know, a king, say king, same, you know that, no, the king's new clothes, that the king is naked. Everybody knows that. A different variation of that is, say a king is walking on the road and the king falls on a banana peel and slips on a banana peel and falls. Now say this is funny. Why is this funny? What is comedy in that? It is funny because you have a king. No, a king is a authority, a position of power. In philosophy, you say it is a moment of trans. It is a transcendental point. The king is in that higher position, but the king is also a man, and all of us are men or women, whatever, human beings, which is a lower position. No? So when we have, say, jokes on farts or jokes on sex or jokes on bodily parts, or which are taken as grotesque elements, they basically identify those moments of our existence, of our reality, which are supposedly finite, which are supposedly related to our bodily finite existence, while the high ideas of king, of authorship, of ownership, which are up there. The point of comedy is that it brings the high into the level of the low, or that is what comedy is supposed to. People say that is what comedy does. No, that comedy in that sense, in a way, subverts, means it brings down the high into the low. But that is not exactly, you know, what is funny. Na? The funny part is not the falling part. The funny part in a king falling on a banana peel is, and this is what we see in many great comedians, that he gets up and he walks as if nothing has happened. This nothing has happened. No, he's still a king. That is the very interesting thing. Na? That you see it in the great comedian Peter Sellers. He falls. You know, you see these movies called Pink Panther. You see that he's a great figure of intelligence, say, and he does a absolutely stupid mistake of falling or doing some stupid thing, but the next moment he reverts back to his identity of being this great inspector, this great thinker, or the great king in that sense. The point is that what is happening? Why is this comedy? The comedy is not just about subverting the high, my high and mighty to the low. The point is that it is a question of whatever is low or whatever is the lower part. it kind of invades the high. That means when the king is now walking on the road as king, there is always a fall. There is always a human side of it, which kind of जिसको बोलते हैं kind of leaks. No, it kind of invades the higher part, the question of this abstract part. There is a concrete which is continuously leaking in the abstract idea of the king. You understand? So hence the king's falling is not funny. What is funny is when he stands up again and walks as if nothing has happened. This is because comedy is again not a question of what material you are using, whether it is high or low. Comedy is about how you are deploying that material. Whether otherwise it would be just laughing at inferior things. No? Otherwise, you understand this, no? That this logic can be applied to a old person falling. Why are you laughing at that old person falling? That is just cruel, because that is something which is, why do we laugh in that sense? The kind of cruelty of laughter. What is the cruelty of laughter? It is that it reasserts, it assures me that I am in a superior position, that the other person is in inferior position. It kind of reassures me of my position, which is that of a superior position. This is not the correct form, or this is not perhaps the right way of understanding comedy. The right way of understanding comedy is my superior position and your inferior position is so messed up together, is so confused together that you cannot for the life of us decipher what is superior and what is inferior. You know, there's these two ideas of comedy which are at play. So when we say that, what about these grotesque materials, what about these popular culture, it is nothing wrong with the cultural elements. I mean, material, anything can be comic, anything can be the source of art. Point is how you are using it, whether you are using it for consumption or whether you are using it for reflection. This is the point.
Thank you, Dr. Soumick. That was a very interesting answer. There's another question in the chat box by Mr. Narasimha Murthy. Okay, there are two questions. One is Mr. Sunil Kumar, who says, how would you rate popular fiction or blockbuster movies on the self-reflective scale?
No, they don't have any self-reflection. That is why they are blockbusters, because something which is consumed, which is immediately consumable, cannot, because you see, it is a question of time. This is a temporal question. What is the thing about blockbusters or whatever, these things? They have to be, the idea of time is very different. The idea of time is that a moment has to be replaced by another moment, has to be replaced by another moment. Exactly like a popular blockbuster movie which you see in the present, which say Marvel's 34th film has to be replaced by Marvel's 35th film, by Marvel's 36th film. So it is an idea of time which is accelerated, but it is an acceleration which is immediately, which is at the same time the same thing is being replaced by another. So you basically, which is called a kind of a whizzing, whizzing of time. Time just whizzes away. It means that atomized moments are replaced by another atomized moment. There is nothing which lingers, which endures. For thought to activate, you need lingering, you need enduring, you need to linger in time, you need to think. So I'll give you an example. Why is it that in today's cinemas, for example, memory becomes such a blunt, rough thing? Yeah? That this representation of memories in cinema is awful these days. So you have some kind of a past that is shown in black and white, in some different kind of a rough. Memory is no longer something which is accessible. Memory is the most difficult thing to access through images, because images always are in a question of present. Images are there in front of you. So images have to be deployed in a very complicated fashion. Images have to be really, you have to really contemplate how to edit, how to put images together so that memory can be evoked. Why? Because memory is a question of time lingering. Memory is, so I had written all of this in the lecture, I didn't talk about it. Memory, for example, if you read Marcel Proust, you have an idea of memory. Memory is in Proust something which is, somebody is having a cup of tea, and suddenly that immediate experience of cup of tea, that is an immediate experience of having a cup of tea. That immediate experience, which is present. So the cup of tea is something which you enjoy, which is in the present, immediate. The cup of tea opens up vast structures of memory. So the cup of tea reminds you of your entire childhood. This is what happens in Proust's Swan's Way, the first volume. That somebody is having a biscuit with a cup of tea, and that kind of it kind of opens up his entire childhood, which is lost now. No, because memory is something which is lost. No? Memory is something which is absent. It is not immediate to you. So there has to be, memory is always something which is which has a temporality. It's a different temporality which has to do with absence and presence. While blockbusters, which are to be immediately consumed, so art has to do with absence and presence. While blockbusters, consumable products, are something which is to be immediately consumed in the sense that they are right there in front of you. And if it is not there, something else will be there. And if that something else is not there, a third thing will be there. So it is a process of accumulation. So accumulation is what? Adding. Adding one after the other. While memory is actually a question of absence. So it is a two different ideas of presence and absence. One is completely present, the other is a play of presence absence, and the nature of time is very different in these two ways, in these two cases. Because one is time which is recollection, which is a time which is recollected, time which is lingers, time which can be stretched. The other is immediate time, in time which is to be absorbed and thrown away. So hence I think blockbusters are hence our own problem also. The inability to think is the inability for us to experience time. We don't experience time the way time was experienced before. This is a problem. This is a problem of modernity, not just today, but yeah. But yeah. In the beginning 19th century, people were still trying to work out whether you can think through this. Even if you can think through this kind of a fragmented, accelerated time, even if is it possible to thought to emerge out of this kind of you know this kind of fragmented time. Today there is no such possibility in that sense. Today is to be consumed in that sense. But this is a difficult question, how within 19th century only it changes. Sorry, 19th, 20th century.
There's another question. I think Mr. Narasimhamurthy has had his hand up for some time. Please go ahead.
Yeah, sorry.
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. Looks like you already answered partially my questions, but still think I will ask. So you spoke about continuous communication. Is it bad or good? Like nowadays we have, this continuous communication through smartphones or, any form. And also my second question is the movies, they're watched by many now. And how it affects the aesthetics, like some are good and many are bad, but still how it affects the aesthetics or the dramaturgy, and what are your thoughts or insights. So the two questions, continuous communication and movies are watched by many. These are my two questions. Thank you, Professor.
No, thank you. No, it's a very lot can be said, but let me just information is, so this is something. Art is not information. Art is not communication. No, on the contrary, the whole point of art is to able to express that which cannot be communicated, which cannot. I cannot tell you hence the more simply way to say is not about information, it is about feelings which can't be communicated. But that is just a simple way of saying that art is not about communication, art is not about information. Art in that sense is useless if information is to be used. Information has a utilitarian perspective. Information has an end, in the sense that information leads to something. It is information leads to a lot of things today. Information leads to efficiency, information leads to achievement, information leads to more and more accumulation. Art is by definition none of these things, no? Art is not a question of accumulation. Art, on the contrary, is a question of subtraction, in the sense that art has to take a step back and reflect, no? And that reflection can be a reflection about society, but that reflection can also be a reflection about art itself. This takes me to your next question, which is the question of movies. That movies can be a question of pure enjoyment. There is not that this movies have this strange kind of an oscillation between being an entertainment and being an art form. There can be bad theater, but theater people are not very confused whether theater is an art form or not. Movies people are always a bit confused, no? Because movies have such a high commercial value, such a high industrial value. So you call it movie industry, you call it so movies in that sense. So what is entertainment? Entertainment today is something. We have to talk a bit about entertainment. Entertainment was defined before as the separation of work from leisure. So entertainment is the prerogative of leisure, while work is something which is separate from. So entertainment emerges with a certain work culture in the 19th century, 18th century, when work gets separated from leisure. But today you see more and more, this relates to your question of information, that you see more and more that there is this boundary between work and leisure is more and more becoming blurred. Work from home, work from, you can take leisure becomes part of corporate, you take corporate holidays. So work and leisure becomes indistinguishable. So entertainment then becomes today infotainment, edutainment, even cognitainment. These are all parts of entertainment. Is a totalizing thing today, of which movie is also a part. So movies become part of education. Movies become part of, so it is very difficult today to. So this is to separate movies from entertainment and place it in terms of art, because art, when movies, the one thing that movie can become is to, movie can expose its possibility to be an art. This is the point. Movie has a possibility to become an art. That doesn't mean that it is art. And what is this possibility? This possibility is all about the movie image, because movie uses images, and cell phone also uses images, and entertainment also uses images. But movie, the image is a thinking image. In what sense? In the sense that when movie deploys an image itself, movie as an art form, in that sense, when it deploys an image, it deploys an image consciously, in the sense that, so for example, I'll give you an example, it'll be easier. So for example, you have a scene where an African American is speaking. So you see a African American, a black person on screen, the image of an African American, and while he is speaking, the voice track plays a southern accent white American. Okay, so you have a disjunction between the image and the voice. So if you have a disjunction like this, then it becomes self-conscious. It brings in a lot of questions about representation, about identity, about race. So it is a conscious deployment of that image. This is something which is akin to art. While you have an image which is that of a building burning, no, which is immediately consumable then. Say, this is the problem which happens with images in blockbusters. In here, you have certain images which are non-reflective images. Basically, they are just there. So this is, I think, the difference.
Thank you. Thank you.
I hope I'm clear. So anything else?
No, like I'm sorry. Like can I ask one more small question? Is it okay?
Yeah.
Just a minute. I think we'll just give some more time to others.
Sure.
That also.
That is fine.
Dr. Pushan trying to unmute
sure.
you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. Yeah, I see. One more question at least that Vani Gupta has asked. Would you like to ask the question, Ms. Vani? Would you like me to ask it? Would you like to ask it yourself? If you like to speak, please put up your hand. So, in the absence of that, okay. I think I've unmuted you.
Hello. Yeah.
Hi, you're audible. Yeah.
Thank you for the very fascinating lecture. It was the first time I heard something like this. So my question was a follow-up on Sunilji's question regarding blockbusters and if they are self-reflective. So I just wanted to ask that, as you mentioned, that there isn't a temporal component in blockbusters, but what about the online series that are like they are in a series, so there's a temporal component involved, and also in the short films or other movies which have a very which portray daily lives of people, or which have not a very happy or
I get your
fairy
point.
tale ending. So in that sort of films, what about, they invoke memory of people. So you mentioned about the memory component. So how are these, can we categorize them as self-reflective? Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. No, see, the point is what I am getting from you, that see, there are plenty of movies which are social dramas, which tackle social issues, which are not about quote unquote entertainment. Say how Captain America is about entertainment. No? But you see the other way around. No, we'll come to the other way around. But the point is, it's not a question of whether a movie has a content which is social and a movie which has a content which is not social. Point is how you see society. No, what is it that you are depicting about society? I mean, how you understand society. Is it that you understand society from the perspective exactly of what we are talking about? What is the problem? Which is the problem of consumption, problem of positivity. The positivity comes in many ways. No, positivity comes in terms of this. I don't know how many of you have seen this Pursuit of Happiness. I don't know how many have seen this movie, but it is a question of happiness. No? Positivity is happiness. Now, what is happiness? Now, philosophy for the longest time have been completely befuddled by what is happiness. Nobody can define what happiness is. There have been books written, but you see in this movie, happiness is very concretely defined in a film like The Pursuit of Happiness, which is based on a social issue, which is about a man who, because of recession, because of the problems of economic problems, is really now in bad economic situation, and this is his idea of a struggle, which is struggle of becoming successful. The point is that in this film, which is supposed to be a social film, success, is defined more or less as happiness. You see Gully Boy, you will understand. Success is defined as happiness. How do you achieve success? You achieve success, or the very idea of achievement is determined by you turn that which is negative into positive. Meaning, you have your weaknesses, you have, say, your financial economic crisis, economic weakness, you transform your economic weakness individually into your own success story. You work hard, you think positive, you know you will do it, but it says nothing about the very structure of economic poverty itself. Why is it that it is there? Why is it that financial crisis happen? It is about a man who basically transforms the negativity of the financial crisis into the positive, which is his success. So this is also a question of positivity. This is also a question of, so when you say that there are social movies happening, yes. Question is, how does it see society? This whole motivational speeches, this whole idea of health and positivity, which these movies, in a way manipulate and deploy, does it actually talk about the very conditions and structures and nature of our society? That is the building. Is society a problem? What we are talking about in the beginning. Does it, not a question of solution? Every one of these movies, almost all of them, provide a solution. We are not interested about solutions. We are interested about knowing the nature of the problem. This is the first part of your question. It is not a question of Netflix or Netflix. Maybe there are good films in Netflix individually, because there are great films which are now available on Netflix also. Point is that there is no distinction between, say, a Scorsese movie and thriller by a B grade movie. Everything is there. So Martin Scorsese recently wrote about Netflix, saying that it has to be curated. Meaning what? Meaning that there is no aesthetic judgment in Netflix. No, you have data mining. So basically, if 10 minutes, so you are exhausted. You are watching a Jason Bourne movie or some Marvel movie, but you might have other expectations from a movie. But it basically takes your information and suggests those movies. It is based upon information. The person before was asking. No, that it is based upon information. It is not based upon aesthetic judgment. It doesn't say that is a good movie or this is a bad movie and gives you the reasons for it. It basically chooses your movies for you on the basis of information. That is, on the basis of the positive knowledge which is accumulated in the virtual reality. So you practically have no distinction between what is good, what is bad. And not that good bad distinction should be there in the moral sense, but in the sense of thinking, that in the sense that why is it that a Scorsese movie is a better movie than a B graded blockbuster, say Captain America. No, not Captain America. I like Captain America sometimes, but I like Captain America when I'm not thinking. Point is, it is a question of consumption. Hardly anybody, I don't know how many series is a basic problem. Series, you see, no, series is exactly, can you make a distinction between series and the Marvel movies? Almost series does exactly what Marvel movies does over a period of 18 years. They have produced these movies which are exactly like a series. Series is becoming the paradigm for making movies only. Hence remakes. Movies, this individual one movie, which has a certain singularity. There's a great director called Stanley Kubrick, who made movies. He just made one movie in each genre. All his life, he made 6 or 7 movies. So one in science fiction, one in horror, one in period drama, but one movie. And that is all. That was all his, because he put everything there. He's all his thinking. Today, it's not that. Today, it's a question of how you can, inexhaustibly manipulate the genre. So it is basically a question of series only, that you have these series which are reproduced continuously. So you have the binge watching, which is also a very strange kind of an activity, because now one can talk about it, because there were earlier movies on the great time when movie was considered as an art, which was 8 hour long movie, one movie, which seems like very similar to what is happening today in binge watching, but it is not, because those movies were actually uh, challenging for you to watch, because it was because it made you think in the way that you experience time. That is, you can't just watch the images, you have to deploy thought in order to understand the images. Series, you just have this narrative which thrills you, and and the images carries you along. You don't have to reflect upon individual images. Understand what I'm trying to say? It's a different temporality altogether.
Dr. Soumick, I see another question. Maybe we
Sorry,
can just quickly address it and wind up in the next
yeah,
5 minutes.
sorry,
That's
sorry.
okay. Yeah, no, not at all. Dr. Mahesh, please. Sorry, just a minute.
Yeah, sorry. I just have a question, which is kind of a reflection from what you said earlier, and just wanted to transform that to healthcare and other aspects of day-to-day life. So when you mentioned about a difference between a cinema and a theater, so theater and the art or the performance changes based on the audience and the importance of audience in theater, in order to create something different every time when you perform. And I was wondering in terms of healthcare, because now we are talking about digital healthcare and education, the issues of education. Now everything is uploaded onto the YouTube or something like that, and asked students to watch and learn. How much difference does it make in terms of these aspects of the presence in a theater, or a presence in a classroom, or a presence in a hospital, and then does it have an impact?
That's a very interesting question you're asking. Yeah. No, this is very interesting. No, of course they are different. So immediately you can see, because theater presupposes a physical gathering of bodies. And the kind of digital healthcare that you are talking about, and of course this kind of a digitization of health in that sense, and not just health in the sense of education and all of that. This kind of it basically, it is a it is very different from the idea of, because I these days when I teach in this psychology and all, you can very easily understand that even in psychology this is a huge problem, because today you have more and more moving away. This kind of digital health is also in the case of psychological health, mental health, is actually moving more and more away from pathology, towards health in general, health as a well-being. Health, you need not be sick. So the relationship between sickness and health, that sickness is the opposite of health, the negativity of health, while health is a positive. This relationship is becoming more and more blurred, in the sense that health itself is becoming a category, a positive category. So you need not be sick to seek health. I mean, to seek counseling, or to seek therapy, particularly in mental health. But even in, for example, this whole health industry, which is to do with food. I mean, um, dietary and yoga and exercise. All of this is basically a moving away, a kind of a moving away from pathology as a negative thing. It is not a question of pathology anymore. Health itself is a positive category, and hence I think, I mean, this, I need more information about this, but I think this digitalization is in a way coinciding with health as a positive category, which is very different from. So theater cannot be a model for this. Theater can't be a model for this, because theater in that sense belongs to a particular time. I mean, not a time, a particular society where negativity is still there. You can understand what I'm saying, that it's not completely this positive health thing which is on screen. You can give counseling, you can work through images, through virtual medium. These are all a condition. These are all elements of a positive society, a society of positivity, a society of transparency. You and I can interact through. This Corona time, it is becoming even more important. Online health checkups and all of that. These are all part of a new kind of a society, which is not where theater emerges from. Theater emerges in a society where physical bodily gathering is very important. Physical proximity, but also physical distance, in the sense of the stage and the people are distant. So it is a different, but it is pre-requirement is body. While this idea of a health, I mean, interestingly, particularly digital, I don't think the pre-requirement is body. The pre-requirement is information. Pre-requirement is some kind of a positive accumulation of information. I don't know how much, because I don't know much about digital health, but I know this much, that this question of health is now an more and more becoming an autonomous category. It no longer depends upon sickness. It no longer depends upon. So this is something which is a major problem within psychology departments, that how do you understand therapy, which is not about, so it is going away more and more from pathology. So yeah, so this is a question of this whole idea of happiness and positivity. It affects psychology a lot, the discipline of psychology. Mental health primarily. So mental health is not psychiatric, psychopathology. That is what is being said.
Thank you, Dr. Soumick, and thank you also, Dr. Mahesh, for a very interesting question. I think we've well exceeded time, and Dr. Soumick has also spent a lot of time with us. And thank you very much, Dr. Soumick, for taking the time and giving us this extremely interesting lecture on a very, very interesting area that clearly, I think, has brought in a lot of diverse dimensions, and also for people from very diverse disciplines, also something to connect to and interact with and follow. So thank you very much.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, the organizers, and yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks a lot. We thank NIAS as well for offering this platform. We thank our Dean and Head Consciousness Studies Program, Professor Sangeeta Menon, for facilitating and also conceptualizing this course. And I thank my colleagues, Ashwini, Niharika, Abhishek, and everyone who's helped with just so much support in making this course possible. And I also thank all of you for attending and coming back for every session. It's wonderful to have you. And we look forward to seeing you all next week for a very, very interesting lecture on self and experience in ethnography. So without further ado, thank you all and see you next week.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting.